Hello.
Hello. Hi, Benji.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. A lot of topics tonight. I saw already. Very tight agenda.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a busy one. Definitely.
Hi, all.
Hey.
How's it going?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
Yes, it is the new year. Sounds
Yeah.
like we're off to an amazing start to 2022 already.
I thought to make things easier for copying things into the live docs, I'll just load up the page on GitHub and just remove the style sheet. Then I can copy and paste it without styles, but it will still have all the links. That'll be nice. I'm just scrolling through GitHub's header, and they've got something in the region of like 200 script tags in there.
Nice.
I just want the style sheet. Like, where is it?
It's in one of those script tags. Yeah.
I think I'm going to have to write an expression in a moment to just locate them and strip them out for me.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, I'm doing that. Document.query selector all.
Hey, everybody.
Hello,
Happy
hello.
New Year.
Same to
I'm
you.
getting our note stock assembled.
Oh,
I do.
Got quite the agenda today.
Yeah, jam-packed.
All right, let me get that link in the agenda file, but I at least shared it there.
Nice, thanks.
Okay, let's kick things off. Welcome everybody to the first working group meeting of 2022. Going through our agenda here, of course, always a quick reminder that we have the Spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct all linked right there. By all showing up, we've agreed to all of those, but there's links there in case you ever want a reminder. We're going to go through a quick intro of attendees. We've got a lot of people on the call today, which is awesome. So rather than giving backstory, just name. That way everyone can do quick name to face, and it's also a good way to make sure all of our microphones are working. We will go through in the order that's shown in the agenda. I'm on top, so hi everyone, Lee Byron.
Hi, I'm Steven.
Hey, I'm Benji.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Michael.
Hi, I'm Matt.
You got Alex here?
Sorry, yeah. Order's weird. Okay, yeah, I'm Alex. Hi.
Rob, hi.
I don't see Oleg in the participation.
Hi, I'm Yakov. I missed my slot earlier.
That's why. Welcome. Lauren, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. So my name is Lauren.
Welcome. I don't see Dotan yet. Or Yuri.
Hey, I'm Sahaj.
Hi, I'm Jordan.
My next. I'm Joe.
Hi, Eloy.
Hi all, Hugh here.
Hi, I'm the one.
I don't see Alan. Or Andrew.
In that case, hello, I'm Rob.
Hi, this is Brian Kim, and I think I'm the last person.
I think so. Do we miss anybody? Anyone not introduce themselves?
I haven't, and I have yet to add myself to the agenda, but I will shortly. Gabriel McAdams.
Hey, welcome, Gabe. No sweat. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for doing that. Keeps us on time. I do have our notes file up. I see magic happening. I see a bunch of people have opened that, which is fantastic. But just a reminder that while Benji has become our default note taker, he also is frequently engaged in discussion. So just a reminder that if folks could jump in there, especially in cases where Benji and Gabe and some of the others that typically take notes for us are in discussion, to make sure that we're keeping up. All right, let's take a quick look at our agenda, make sure there's a lot on here. I have a suspicion that we might have to move some of these towards the end to a next meeting, but we'll do our best to stay in the time bounds that we've got and get through all of it. We're going to take a quick look through action items. If there are too many of those, I might wait and do some of those after the meeting. We're going to talk a bit about security vulnerabilities. Matt is going to talk us through fragment modularity, a very interesting thing about formatting the spec with Prettier, normalization force of directives, advancing default value, validation, coercion rules, named lists, an update on client-controlled nullability, directives on directives, deprecation of input values, and an update on defer and stream. That is a bunch of stuff, but is that a complete list? Anything else that we need to talk about today that's not captured here?
Who's the TSC?
Great question. I'm waiting on Brian to round up the vote. We put them into a third-party tool, so I actually don't know who it has and has not voted from the TSC members who are voting. I think we were missing one, and he was going to like let them take a couple of days to figure it out, but we're going to cut it today. Actually, let me just check my email real fast and see if I have anything from Brian, because he said he was going to cut it this morning. I do. All right. Hot off the presses. I'm literally reading the email from Brian for the first time because he sent it 5 minutes ago. The 5 winners in alphabetical order, thank you, Brian, are Benji Gillum, Ivan Goncharov, Marc-Andre Garreau, Matt Mahoney, and Michael Stipe. Congratulations to the 5 of you. You are now burdened with the responsibilities of the TSC.
Congrats all. That's awesome.
And great to see a couple returning faces, Benji, Ivan, and Matt were in the previous term. So you guys have keep your seats. That's our 5. I will later today go through and update everything to make sure that our current TSC list is there, and we have some GitHub groups and stuff that give people the right access. I'll get those updated. Good question. Glad I looked. Okay, let's dig in. Benji, this first one is yours. Defining a process for security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I wanted to know who the TSC were that I was going to be talking to. So yeah, this working group is a meeting for us as the TSC and also us as the working group. So I can't talk to you here about any actual security vulnerabilities that haven't yet been disclosed, but what I can say is that we don't seem to have a good process for reporting and discussing security vulnerabilities. We do seem to have a process in place when it comes to something like GraphQL JS, but when there's issues that might affect the entire ecosystem, we don't seem to have a good process in place. At least I couldn't find it. And I'm a TSC member, so I should be able to find that. So I was interested to know what we should do with regard to this, or who should take charge of organizing that. And basically, do we have anything? What is the process currently? How have we handled previous security issues, and so on?
I don't know that we've managed that many security issues. The only one that I can think of was from a little bit earlier last year. There was a potential cross-site scripting hole found in GraphQL, which the impact of that ended up being relatively low, and we managed it kind of exclusively through that project.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not quite getting at what you're talking about, which is if there's a broader security vulnerability that might impact multiple projects in similar ways, how we go about managing that. I don't think we have any kind of process for that because there's not been too much of that so far, which I guess is a good thing.
Yeah.
Not to say that there won't be others in the future, but we should certainly have a process for this.
So what do you think that process should look like? I mean, we certainly should have a link on an obvious web page like graphql.org or something like that, having a link saying what the process for reporting a security vulnerability is. I would say that probably the TSC themselves should be responsible for handling security issues and then for, you know, delegating management of them to the relevant places. Would you say that that seems reasonable?
That seems reasonable to me.
So there needs to be a place where people can reach out either to a TSC member or to the TSC as a whole. I believe Brian actually raised, yeah, this should be in the linked item, but I don't have it open right now. RFC, yeah. So Brian actually raised this paragraph of text. You can see it in the quote text in the linked article, but it basically says, it basically says that TSC members can have issues disclosed to them. They will keep it secret to the TSC until the TSC as a whole decides to, you know, discusses it and then decides to act upon it or whatever. So I think that for a start, we should adopt something like this. But it would also be nice to just have a public and potentially secure way of receiving these. And I'm not really sure what the best approach for that is.
My sense is starting with something is better than starting with the right thing. And if it doesn't work, we can iterate, because not having, basically, like if somebody wants to report something and they end up reporting it in a public way, that ends up creating more churn than anyone wants. Like, that's not good. I'll have a careful read over Brian's and your edit, but my sense is that probably whatever you guys have assembled here is going to be reasonable. I don't know, there's a bunch of folks on the call. Has anybody else set up security vuln receiving processes? Any advice from anyone who's worked close to this kind of problem before?
I want to give a bit of context on what we're discussing. Recently, it was like person who contacted like part of TSC to discuss a vulnerability, but in reality, we had like similar issue from time to time. Like one of them you fixed like years ago. It's like for a null validation on the like nullest defaults of query variables. It's a way of bypassing, like technically it was fixed in Spec, it was fixed in implementation, but it never was documented for like the ecosystem as a whole. It's safe to say about it because it's like 2 years past, so every Spec compliant implementation already like patched. Another even more abstract thing is like limitation on validation errors. Like a couple of years ago, people start getting bug bounties for creating queries that generate huge amount of errors. So every popular GraphQL implementation implement limited number of errors independently. Like I think like GraphQL JS was like 2 years ago, and GraphQL Java like 1 year ago or something. So sometimes it's like related to a spec, sometimes it's not related to a spec, but there is like security stuff. Like mostly it's like nothing like, I don't expect like arbitrary code execution is possible through a spec or through like, it's probably implementation specific, yeah. But stuff like denial of service or bypass of like validation, it's happening like once in a couple of months somebody discovers something, or infinite recursion somewhere. And since we kind of maintain reference implementation, what I'm doing right now is like just fixing reference implementation. One thing I want to mention, we have implementers group. I don't know if it's like, if it's trusted place, but I think it should be part of the process. Just wanted to give a context of what we mean by like security vulnerability for entire ecosystem.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. So I think there's a couple pieces here that we need to do. First is a safe reporting And I think Benji, what you have here looks great. I think probably the one thing Brian can help us with is just making it even easier, like just saying like reach out to one of these people. It's like which one, what if they don't respond? And so I think Brian can probably set up an email alias for us, and that'll probably smooth things out. security@graphql.org or something like that. That way there's just like one very clear place to send the stuff. And then we should probably set up like a step-by-step process. Like how do we typically want to go through disclosure, where it's like everyone in the TSC figures this out, comes up with a plan. I like the idea of first going to that implementers group. We can probably start private discussions amongst that GitHub group. And then writing up a CVE if we have to. But yeah, if anybody else wants to, Benji's kind of taking the lead here to make some edits. Brian's done some good work there as well. If Sahaj, Yvonne, it sounds like you guys have both faced some of this. So if you want to participate in assembling the process, I think that would be super valuable.
The other main question is, how do we get the TSC's attention for actually dealing with this? Like when someone's reported it through security@graphql.org, which I think is a fantastic idea, someone is going to then take that and put it somewhere to open a discussion. Where should that be?
Yeah.
Should that be the TSC discussions board on GitHub?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Okay, I think that's fine for me, and we're short on time, so let's move on. But thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for advancing this. This is super useful. It shows kind of the maturity of where we are as a group defining.
I have a quick probing question. Are we saying that there is a security vulnerability in the spec right now that's undisclosed, or this is all hypothetical?
I can provide a little bit context. Like, as far as I know, like the thing about no bypassing validation, when bypassing validation by using default value, it was fixed a year ago, and it was the only one vulnerability in the spec itself. Rest is like vulnerability in like GraphQL.js and like not JavaScript specific vulnerability in reference implementation, meaning like everybody else basically doing the same, and we recommend other people doing the same. So like, as far as I personally know, there is no like vulnerability in Spec. It's mostly like implementation details, but implementation details that is like copy pasted in different implementations.
Yeah.
There's
Brian,
also
I think another way to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there's also situations where people think there may be a vulnerability and it turns out there has not been. And like we want a path for that too. And the TSC is probably the right group to investigate, because presumably they should have enough knowledge without disclosing it to the entire world while the investigation is in process.
Yeah. Brian, I was going to say that I think part of the problem here is that disclosure is ambiguous right now, because we don't, like if you said, what are the security vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in the past? There's nowhere to go. There's no even definition for what would count as a security vulnerability. And so like we don't really have a good process there. I think we should. Yeah.
I hear you're a lawyer. Or used to be.
Learning. I've learned more about open source law than I care to know. All right, thank you all for doing this. We will make progress on this.
Hey, Lee?
Yes.
Sorry, I missed a few notes while I was looking something up. So I think, yeah, the bare minimum should be to have a security at or abuse at. That's like common practice.
Yeah.
Email alias. But also, I linked it in this chat. I don't know what the best place is right now, but GitHub has actually some infrastructure for these types of things as well right now, which might be a good place for people to know where to go rather than having to wade through documents. And it also allows for, I believe, I haven't had to use it luckily myself yet, but for initial private discussion that can then be promoted to public.
That's super cool. It looks like they will set up a security markdown file for you and stuff. That's awesome. We'll have to do a little bit of reading and see what it does and doesn't do and try to leverage that. Thanks for pointing that out. All right, Matt, the floor is yours for fragment modularity.
Yeah, so this is going to just be basically a call for volunteers, for people who are interested. I don't want to get super into depth in the actual discussion because I think that before we have a deep working group discussion, it's valuable to have some iteration, have some thought put into it, have some editing clarification. So in short, the problem is multiple client implementations, at least within Facebook/Meta, have found that one of the key issues we've run into over and over and over again in a lot of different contexts is that a fragment is a facade. In the spec, it acts more as copy paste as opposed to as its own independent thing. And there's not really a way to, in a response that you get, to decompose that response into individual fragments unless you know everything about the response up front. So this is basically a call. I put an RFC that Benji merged into the GraphQL working group /RFCs. Basically, we want to explore, we've got a few ideas in a few different areas. The we is right now me, Joe Savona, and Jordan Eldridge. But we want it to be a lot more people. I know Alex Riley might be interested because this touches on client-controlled nullability. But basically, there's a few different areas that we would likely want to explore. One of them being what's the right response format. One of them being what's the right syntax. One of them being, is there some way that we can do this completely with the existing spec in a way that feels clean? And yeah, we basically want to explore and iterate quickly on this. So if you're interested, feel free to ping me on Discord or GitHub. Feel free to comment on that RFC that I've posted in the GraphQL working group agenda. Yeah, any other questions, thoughts?
Thanks for getting everything documented there. I know we talked a little bit about this last time you brought it up in a meeting. I'm excited that we're coming back to this problem. I think last time we talked about it was Joe and me probably talking about this 5 years ago, and
that sounds right.
ended up at we don't know, and it's probably best to keep things simple while we don't know, but we want to come back to it, and a lot of time has passed, so now we know a lot more. Time to come back to it.
And it touches on so many other aspects of the design, so I think it's really important to get right.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll just press is because I took a quick read through of the solution space doc that you guys assembled. Is as you explore the solution space, you find syntax that you would then see as potentially expanding beyond fragments themselves. So considering ramifications of following each of the syntax paths. But yeah, I'm super excited about this. So yeah, please, anyone interested, take up Matt and Joe's call to participate in this one.
Where do you want discussion to happen now that the PR has been closed?
For now, feel free to do it on the PR commit that's been closed. That's fine. And then probably I'll figure out some better.
We have a new feature turned on in the WG repo called discussions. It is pretty cool for exactly this kind of thing. So I would suggest opening a GitHub discussion about this prompt. You can stick links to the stuff you want in the top, and it has one extra level of threading compared to a typical issue, and it doesn't get closed because it's not a thing that you complete in the same way. So that's probably the right way to do that.
The threading is very, very nice. That's good.
Oh, good to
I used
know.
to complain all the time that GitHub's tools sucked, and then in the last 2 years they've gotten much better. Discussions being amongst them.
The search is still kind of horrible though for discussions.
It is,
but, yeah.
search in general is so bad on GitHub. I don't understand.
It is.
It's never worked very well.
No.
I just want to like grep a repo, and it's just like, yeah. Anyway, don't want to take up too much time griping. Okay, thank you, Matt, and the folks who contributed to that. Super excited to see where that goes. Benji, the next agenda item is yours.
All right, I'll be super quick on this one. We've talked about this a number of times over the past few years. There's been a lot of work done towards it in little stints over the last few years, but I believe that we are ready. The October 2021 release is out. We are ready, I think, to merge the Prettier formatted spec. I updated that today. So assuming we haven't merged anything in the last few hours, it should be fine to merge right now. I have done a diff, but I would recommend that other people check that what I've done is sane. But basically, I started by just adding the tooling. Then I've got another commit after that that actually runs Prettier and formats the spec. If you then build the output HTML and compare that to the output HTML of what was there before, they're not exactly the same because the links change, because the line numbers in the source code change. But if you remove those bits, if you remove the actual links to the source code, it is identical, like the SHA sum matches. So it, as far as I can tell, other than the links to the source code, it doesn't actually change the generated spec at all. So it should be safe to merge. That said, it does also format the other documents like the README, the YAML files, and various other things. So it is worth having a bit of a look over. I would read the two commits separately, but yeah, I'm keen to get this merged.
Heck yeah, the time has come. Sorry for letting this one sit. It was blocked on so many different things at any one point in time. But all right, I'm adding this to the top of my to-do list for after the meeting ends, is to do a quick read through of that. But I'm gonna assume that your diff is strong since it's many years of work. Thank you for that. Anything else that you want to ask for there, or is it just attention?
No, I just want to merge so I don't have to do it again.
You know what? Screw it. I'm hitting the button right now. If there's any issues, we'll just fix them later.
I have a quick question. Can we make links to code samples table? Like maybe even require people to name code samples, because it's like worrying me that the changing if you move stuff in Markdown. It's not a big issue, but if somebody wants to work on it.
The Prettier does not change the format of the code. I mean, the code is already formatted according to Prettier. So it might change in future when a new version of Prettier comes out. Is that what you're saying? Got it.
Yeah, or people like manually format, or people like add text. Like if we can, it's better to have like as much as possible like stable links. And for something like a spec, we can just require people to name code fragments. Anyway, like if we're asking people to name GraphQL queries, we can ask them to name like code samples inside the spec. If somebody wants to work on something like that.
I'm a little less worried about that, just because I think that's like part of the goal of doing this, right? It's like now there's fewer reasons for stuff to get changed out from under us. I guess, yeah, Prettier's version could change, but and it was the reason why we waited until the spec cut to do this, so that anyone who is taking links on the draft knows.
To clear my thought process, it's not like a problem with like humongous amount of work that Benji did, but it's like idea for somebody who want to volunteer and do something and start like contributing to a spec. It's like,
yeah, makes sense.
If I understand, it's basically we should make sure that any links that you provide to the spec stay stable throughout the lifetime of the spec, even as we're like, even when somebody adds a paragraph somewhere.
That should generally be the case based on how the tool works already. They only change when the contents change. And so I think what Yvonne is asking for is to putting on some nominal marker so that even if you change the contents, the nominal markers link would stay nominal and therefore wouldn't change. Which is definitely a cool idea, but like in general, they should be stable. But also the reason why I'm not super concerned about it is this is the entire purpose of cutting versions of the spec, is you have a immutable document that we guarantee we're not going to go back and change. And the draft can continue to evolve. So if you're linking to the draft and your link all of a sudden dies because we've seriously edited the area you linked to, well, there's only so much we can do about that. But yeah, it's a good idea. Okay. Merged. Let's keep going. Yakov, the floor is yours for normative force of directives.
Thanks. So this came up in terms of the defer and stream directives. There was a whole discussion as to what the normative force of those directives should be. And I just basically kind of realized that it might be confusing just in general to newcomers, it certainly was to me, newcomers to GraphQL, that directives in general could have different normative forces, meaning some of them maybe must be followed by the servers, whereas some of them should be. And I think probably that's part of what led to my initial and maybe still doubting whether we should have that normative force of defer and stream be dropped from must but to should, but partly it's because it's just unclear that how to do directives direct things. So this is basically the PR that's linked in the agenda is basically just to codify how I believe the current state of things is, which is that there is no specific normative force for a directive, and it depends on the directive. And the language I have in there, is supposed to specify that even give additional flexibility, even directives may have different normative forces depending on whatever they want, really. That we're not really giving any limits to that. So that basically the idea of this is just to clarify within the spec the current, what I believe, I guess, is the current state of things, which gives us, future flexibility.
I added a comment in on that PR just for posterity, but my only thought that could make this a little bit more clear is that if a directive is defined by the spec, it's normative. It's not just extra information. Like if you say that a field is at skip or at include, or if you say that in an SDL that something is deprecated, like those things are true. There's must language there. They're normative. So that goes beyond just providing extra information. But for custom directives, then I don't know exactly what the best way to phrase this, but I think what you're getting at is exactly right, where from the specs point of view, at least, there's only so much you can know about it. It's just annotated information, but some other spec may have some normative understanding of that, right? Like if you have a tool that makes use of it. And for defer and stream, the goal for those directives is to be included into the spec. So I would expect those to have whatever normative semantics that the spec describes. Does that seem right?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Meaning the distinction, I think, is not, well, the way I see it, the distinction wouldn't be between directives included in the spec and custom directives, but meaning even the defer and stream directives, they're at a should level, or at least in the proposal that we have now, so that if when they get merged, hopefully very soon, some of our spec directives will be must, they must be honored, and some of them should be honored, and it should be as described by the spec or as described wherever these custom directives are described. And so you have to follow to the extent, of that normative force. I think we may have to work on the language, but I think we're all in agreement. And I think this just, just clarifies that, directives, direct things, to the extent that they are defined to do so. That's it.
Just as a little clarification there, you state that the deference stream are shoulds right now, and I think I know what you mean by that. Like the server can choose to not stream something if it doesn't want to, but I think that's at a different level. Like it must follow the rules of stream and defer, and the rules of stream and defer are that it may choose to stream the result, i.e. the actual specified for behavior for defer and stream is where the should appears, rather than whether or not you obey the directive. Like the directive can be experienced in two different ways. Like it can do nothing or it can do something. Much like with skip, if you say skip false, then you're ignoring that directive, right? You're not removing anything. It's not doing anything. It's not affecting the result, but it's still being honored. It's kind of subtle and semantics, but I think that it's still like the directives in the spec must be obeyed, but their own rules within that can have shoulds in them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate, and I think we don't have to take up extra time here. I guess we're all in agreement, but we might have to fix the language in what I'm suggesting. But yeah, I think we can do that asynchronously if offline if everyone is okay. And I guess the best place would be in that PR.
Yeah. Thanks for prodding at this. I think getting things in a clear state is always a good goal for us. From the discussion, it sounds like there's some extra clarity we can even add beyond what you've done here. But thanks for poking at this. Hopefully it'll end up even more clear than we started.
I have a small question, and we can continue it offline, just like, because I think what we're touching is like we have more and more complex proxies, like for different reasons, for different services, like GraphCDN or like Apollo Federation or like GraphQL tools, bunch of libraries doing proxy stuff. So when you're proxying GraphQL API and you expose a schema, directives through a schema for introspection without understanding like a meaning of directives, should it like be allowed, or proxies should expose only directives that they understand? Because we're adding like things that server can ignore directives. For example, I'm writing a proxy source original server support stream and defer. My proxy don't know anything about like this particular directives. It's like just proxy and introspection. And like, is it normal or not?
Yeah, what I have in the spec draft for defer stream now is that the introspection is the way that a client knows that the server supports defer stream. So if you are seeing that in your schema, then it should be expected that it's going to be supported. And if it's going through a proxy, I don't think that a proxy should like unwrap the defer streams happening and buffer everything and send it back in one response.
I think oh, sorry.
I wanted to clarify. So maybe it's a little bit different from Jakub, from your original question. But if we say like, I think we need to be extra careful with the wording and not to like make bad thing. I'm actually don't know what's the correct solution. What if server was, what if proxy tool was written like 2 years ago and without any knowledge about stream and defer? So like, I don't know the correct solution, but once we add it in a spec, we cannot like remove it basically. So I would be extra careful for wording not to trigger this case of like exposing directives without understanding what they're doing.
Ivan, are you talking about the opposite case that Rob is talking about? Meaning, Rob is talking about, if I understand correctly, he's talking about a proxy that sees the defer and stream directives, but doesn't really pass them along. It sounded like to me like you were talking about the opposite, about a proxy that doesn't understand defer and stream, and therefore can't pass them along. So I think, but Ivan, I think your case is much easier. Meaning, whenever the defer, meaning the proxy shouldn't be exposing directives it doesn't understand, so it just won't pass them along, and then nothing will be deferred and streamed, and all will be well.
Yeah, but reality, I think like I need to check, but I think most of the tools like just re-exposing everything that the original server is exposing. I need to check like I didn't check.
Yeah, it's very possible somebody had wrote a proxy that does this, not knowing that defer or stream will ever be a thing.
I don't want to get too deep into this because I know we have a topic on this later, and we're getting a little bit far afield of the original topic. But suffice to say, there's room for us to clarify what to do with directives at this layer. But that sounds like it's much bigger than what Yakov was exploring.
Actually, if I allowed, I want to make one comment about it. I'm
Please.
I wrote GraphQL in Haskell, and mostly writing directives in the Haskell, where you want to be correct with all type system, is kind of hard because it's too powerful, I would say. There is no limitations. For example, am I allowing only just validation stuff, or am I allowing to transform the type information, or am I allowing to also resolve the stuff? And there are too much power inside, and it will be, I suppose it will be beneficial maybe if we allow some more limitations about the stuff and separate them.
This conversation has come up in the past, and we've always sort of landed on the knife's edge between generally agreeing that slowly restricting what directives can do over time would be useful, but then failing to find the actual boundary of what should be in or out. There's some more, I would say, creative uses of directives out there that I think most people would look at and say, yeah, that's probably not maintainable or a good use of something in production. But at the same time, it's interesting and cool that people can use directives to do pretty creative things and explore ideas. And that was always the original intent of the directive, is to, it's a way out, it's a hook to allow for experimentation. And I think actually Yakov's, the core of Yakov's additional note here is right on. What it is metadata. You're adding metadata to your query. You can have some tool downstream that interprets that metadata and does something. That might be changing a type, that might be making some radical transformation to the query itself, that who knows. As far as the GraphQL spec knows, it's metadata. I don't know if we can reasonably restrict that in the short term, but I think that is, everyone agrees that there's abuses of that, and no one expects every tool to be perfect and allow all possible variations. I do want to keep us moving because we got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Next up is default value validation and coercion. Benji, you added this one, so I'll hand it to you.
Oh yes, this is me. Okay, great. So we, Lee, you did a lot of work yourself on this. You've raised, I believe, a series of pull requests to GraphQL.js. And last I saw in September, you said, this looks good to go. And asked for any implementers to say if there's issues. There wasn't any issues listed below. I assume you haven't heard through separate channels of problems.
I have not heard of that. I saw a couple of thumbs up on that, but it was just from folks who are typically in these meetings. This, for what it's worth, linking back to our previous conversation about security vulnerabilities, This is one that I think probably would make the cut that we would want to sort of like formally disclose. There is a way in which you can inject a null into a program and where that program does not expect a null. Most implementations probably will fail gracefully, but it's entirely possible that they won't, in which case you can, cause the service outage. That's the sort of backing motivation behind this. So yeah, I definitely want to advance it. If I remember correctly, a primary reason why there were two reasons why we were waiting on merging the reference implementation changes themselves. The first of which was there was a in-flight migration to TypeScript, and we didn't want to collide with that, along with an upcoming major release. That has now since passed. So I think we're good to, I need to make sure I rebase all my commits on top of those and make sure nothing broke in the process. The other was that waiting for input, there were a few, lagging concerns people had. And the way to resolve those was that we were gonna ask for feedback and wait, which we've done. But this is a good reminder for folks that are maybe newer to this topic or haven't taken a look yet. It's well worth reading through some of the backstory here, or if you want to just kind of get a sense of exactly what the outcome is. Hopefully my pull request does a reasonable job at that, because I've added some graphics that explain a somewhat complicated problem. And make sure that you provide some input, because yes, I would like to prioritize resuming this.
Okay, fantastic. And also as an update for you, I have looked through what you've done in GraphQL JS, and then I've tried to rewrite that into spec text. We did have spec text before, but you took a slightly different approach. So I've tried to reflect that. Well, basically look at it and see whether I've done a good job or not. Edits welcome. But yeah, should you and I aim to advance this like before the next, or maybe the one after the next working group?
Yeah, let's see how far we can get before the next one and advance. I think that would be great. And yeah, thank you for doing that. I forgot that was the other, like we started with your proposal, and then I sort of took it on a run as I actually figured out what the implementation ramifications of that were going to be. So getting that back into the spec text was also a blocker. So my sense is that we're actually pretty close to advancing it. We just need to kind of re-review our own existing work and make sure that everything is aligned. But yeah, thank you for doing that. We'll try to make progress. Anybody else have questions, thoughts? Cool.
Okay.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Okay, so I'm proposing the new feature. It's named lists. It's kind of in most of the languages you have some kind of lists that have some constraint. For example, it should not contain some duplicates, or for example, in Haskell we have also non-empty, which means that the list cannot be empty, or hypothetically, we could also add another additional constraint. And we, for example, that list has some specific length. For example, for RGB values, this list should have, for example, 3 elements or something like that. And for that reason, now we are just using lists, but we don't signal anything to the client. Client doesn't know that, for example, this list should not be non-empty, and it still will validate before it will use it. For example, in Haskell, I could just, if I know that this list is non-empty, I will convert to the specific type and use it in my library. However, GraphQL does not support this feature yet, and actually it's not quite hard, because nowadays lists have in introspection, the lists have a kind list, but does not have any name, and we can add this information name to the lists. And list definition, should I share my screen, or are you can also click on the issue to see how list can be defined. What do you prefer?
Go ahead. You can share your screen, especially if you want to point to something specific. It's helpful.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that.
Oh, really? No worry if not.
So what you essentially want to do is add semantics to the list, like it's a set or whatever.
Yes, and it will not change anything for the client who does not support the list, for example. For the newest clients who support this functionality, they will get additional information about the lists, about the constraints.
This is an interesting idea, and a part of what I think is most interesting is that it is, this is not the first time that we've proposed some sort of generics syntax, and with generics, my concern is always writing a type system that interprets generics throughout is quite hard and can get very complicated, and it's easy to make mistakes. And so this actually is a much simpler version of that is restricted to a single key, and it's overlapping an existing type, so it's purely additive. Do you see? So like one potential restriction I see here is two frequent cases people to ask for generics before. One is a map type, to be able to say I have keys and I have values, and how you model that kind of depends. But someone wants to be able to say I have map k comma v. Or the other is connections or pagination. So like relay style connections, to be able to say a connection of, pages, or a connection of some object as a generic syntax. Those presumably don't desugar into just lists with metadata. They'd be more complicated. Does this preclude us from exploring that space in the future?
Actually, for that, I have another question about the tuples, which actually I read about your problem about the generics, why you at the start you did not support that. First, it's problematic with the type name, so you don't know how to name that. However, if you have tuple with, and let's constrain it to just two elements, you don't normally ask the type name on the tuple. So you will have this tuple, and it will still use kind of wrapping syntax, and it will not get complicated to the type system for the types and input values.
So what? I've read your issue, and essentially you're introducing new syntax, but in order to get semantic lists, that is the base proposal here, or? To have semantic lists, and semantics could also be just added with the directive.
But they are not displayed to the introspection.
That depends on the spec. If we have a new spec directive, like list semantics or whatever, the naming is another thing, then this displays in the introspection, like for instance, deprecated. It's a directive when you build your schema, but it becomes available through the introspection. So it could be the same thing.
Yeah,
there's the tricky part with directives here is there's not actually a position where you'd put that. Like imagine nested named lists, and if the nested one is the one that has the name, like where would you put the directive to do that?
You're right. I just had this simple example that you had there with one nesting, but you're right. As soon as you have nested lists.
Yeah. So I think this is interesting. I think this is definitely worth exploring from my point of view. I think problems are, we can bike shed on syntax and try to get a better understanding of the ramifications of any syntax choice that we would make. I think especially Matt raised some issues on the pull request earlier about the colliding with the generic syntax And I think that's reasonable. The other is, go and look back at the discussions that happened around custom scalars. There's a lot of follow-on work around custom scalars to get to the point where we felt like the schema had enough semantic information for tools to actually be able to do something with them. I think most notably was the specified by directive. It's probably the most important. Presumably you'd want something similar here. Like if you just see that, my schema defines a named list called set, what is a client supposed to do with that? And is that the same as, something else? That's kind of the problem that directive set out to solve. But this is interesting. I think like another thing that I would love to see is a little bit more motivations behind it. So like, how frequently are people going to find themselves using this? Is this something that is a broad problem? Is this a niche problem? So I think like problem exploration will also be really helpful.
Yes, I mean, in my case, it was some requests, pull requests in my library and some issues regarding that. And after that, I decided to explore how we could support that kind of collections. And I chose the simplest way, what was possible before I tried to put some parameters inside and to more generalize and blah, 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 but it was too complicated at the end. That's why I just went for the simple ones. However, I don't know in other languages what if it's pretty frequent or not. But one point for it is that even if it's not frequent, it does not really adds too much extra complexity to the language, and it could be kind of useful feature.
I think that's probably right, though generally we have a very high standard for new syntax just because even the simplest change often has unforeseen downstream ramifications. And so we want to hold a really high bar to make sure every change we add is adding a lot of value. There's also, another one of our principles is that we want GraphQL to remain as simple as possible. And learnability is pretty important. So anytime that we add extra features, we want to make sure, at least a plurality of people using GraphQL are likely to encounter and use that feature. So we don't end up with like a long tail of edge case features for power users, where the vast majority of people use, a tiny set of the features. So I think that problem exploration is going to really help. It also, it's not surprising to me that you're coming from a Haskell-based tooling environment where types are the first class primitive, and people are looking at GraphQL and saying, wow, I find GraphQL's type system quite lacking in comparison to Haskell. No big surprise for me. That's a little bit by design. It is intentionally a dramatically simpler type system for a lot of those reasons. So that's not to say that it shouldn't expand. I think these are actually really interesting ways for it to expand. But even if you end up on something that feels really polished and good, it still leaves open this question of how many people are going to actually use this thing. And so I think that's my advice to you, is to go explore that problem a little bit more.
Yes. I mean, I can explore more generally what use cases can be, which use cases could be founded more than just set and non-empty. I mean, there is also a workaround solution for maps, where the list will require that it object has key with non-duplicate value, or some kind of homogeneous tuples where the values are same. However, the size of the list are always restricted. For example, color values, RGB values, or vectors with points, for example, where you have X, Y, Z values or kind of stuff. However, I don't know how often they will be used. That's why I think there should be some survey, or maybe, I don't know, maybe some discussion where the people may comment or make some up or down.
Yeah, I think opening this discussion is a good idea, and collecting use cases. maybe another way to think about this is to flip it around, and instead of saying, if we had named lists, how would people use them? And instead flip it around and saying, what are all the ways in which we want to expand the type system that are in the same ballpark as the problem that named lists solve, and then see like which ones named lists solves well and which ones it solves less well. Ideally, we don't end up with like a broad collection of tools within the type system, but we have a small collection that are powerful. And if that sometimes means that things are awkward, like that might be a reasonable trade-off. But I think that's probably the next step to explore.
Yes.
Anyone else have thoughts? Steven, I see your hand up.
Yeah, it's interesting that we we just brought up that you can't apply directives onto nested lists because that actually is something that would be solved by this. It would that would be something that would be made possible by kind of having a name declaration for list.
Potentially true. Yeah. Interesting thing to explore.
I was just going to point out, like I think things like maps and sets are interesting because it's not with I feel like with those you wouldn't just want to be able to express that like a type like has that semantic, but you might actually want like syntactic features. Like if a field returns a map, I want to be able to do like a query that says, is this key in that map? And so how do you express that? Or like, I want to fetch this, like this key of that value. And so like, so it goes beyond just the type system supporting it, but into like syntax for like queries consuming those types in more significant ways. So, which I think would be really interesting to add, but like, it like goes beyond the type system is the main point I wanted to raise.
Yeah, as a point on that, Facebook, or at least like Relay, I think also does this specifically where the client interacts with connection, not as the connection type necessarily, but as like a special list type. So we already have ways that clients are operating on generic types, and like we already have workaround solutions. So figuring out what those existing workaround solutions are, and if we can collapse most of them, or ideally all of those weird generic workarounds into a single like spec compliant solution, would be really, really cool. But that might be asking way too much.
Interesting space to explore, that's for sure. Anyone else have questions or feedback for Tavit?
We're about 5 minutes behind schedule. We're doing pretty good. Well done.
Nice. Thanks for presenting this, Tavit. I think this is super interesting. It's a great first step into the exploration. I'm really excited to see where this goes. I'm gonna hand it to Alex next to give us an update on client-controlled nullability.
Hello. Yeah, so where are we? Discussion has continued about the list nullability syntax and what to do with the question mark, whether it's catching nulls or it's an error catching mechanism or something. Jordan and Joe just left some feedback on the PR yesterday. Sure, we'll go with yesterday. I haven't gotten a chance to respond to that yet. Other than that, though, I'm pretty blocked at the moment. We're waiting on a way to release this experimentally. So we need experimental flags to be available in GraphQL JS. I don't really have anything else I can do until then. Yeah.
Yeah, we have implemented it also now. So it's available at least in .NET now,
okay,
in the newest release. If you want to play from a client side with it, I can set up your server. So that's possible. We are at the moment, I'm looking into updating the language server. We have forked it so that we can play around it nicer in something like graphical. And I think maybe next week we have the syntax in.
Cool. Yeah, we can talk more about that and see about getting set up. The other thing I have on here is that for list nullability syntax, I think it's really just going to come down to a matter of taste, like, you know, a personal preference. I don't want to make like a unilateral decision on the list syntax, but like how are decisions on things made typically when there isn't consensus? Is there a vote, or how does that work typically?
If we have to, we will do a TSC vote on something, but it's a little bit unprecedented. Typically, our mode has been, if we can't decide on what the right thing is, we just don't do anything. And that feels like it sucks, but it like has the really great outcome of we don't put controversial things into the language. And so I think that's probably a reasonable principle to continue to uphold. Not to say that this ends up being deadlocked, but to say that we need to explore some way to find, it doesn't have to be consensus, but there should be at least like a small number of detractors who are willing to say, you know, that's not my favorite syntax, but I don't care about it enough to sort of hold up the process. And because like, I agree, a lot of this comes down to taste. What might be helpful, especially for this list thing, is I feel like we've been exploring it in abstract quite a lot of like, here's what it looks like for a list of 1, here's what it looks like for a list of depth 4. And it's like, okay, what does this look like for a real query that comes out of someone's real project? And is that confusing or helpful? And hopefully that resolves, or at least pushes us in a direction. Like if we have to, like, let's pull it back to practicality if we can, just to try to add some extra data point purely beyond taste.
Yeah.
But that would be my hope, is that we can at least push it to the direction where you get a majority opinion in one, and the remainder set of folks who would prefer the other agree that it's stylistic and that they're not willing to hold up the process.
Do we know of any GraphQL specs that actually have doubly nested lists? GraphQL schemas, sorry.
This is also my question. I think we're looking at a lot of like really deeply nested lists, and I don't think in practice those come out a lot.
So 3 you have, so doubly nested, if you're talking about geotypes, then you run into that. But I think the most I saw is 3 nestings with geotypes.
It's like, it's got to be like log 100 or something. It's like the number of double nested lists compared to the number of lists is like log 100, the first one. Similarly, so for triplets, it's like quad nested lists like technically can exist, but there may be like one of them in like a test case somewhere, and like that's the limit. And like that's just the ones that exist, let alone the ones that you're forcing nullability changing rules on. I think like a single, like the most important is the ability to say, I understand the difference between enforcing the nullability of the thing inside a list versus the nullability of the thing outside a list. And for that syntax to at least be able to extend, like it must support nested lists. It doesn't necessarily have to be beautiful in nested lists, because that is not a common case. But a list, and then being able to address the thing inside the list and the list itself separately is more likely to be a case people encounter.
Relay doesn't support nested lists at all, and it's never been a problem.
There's an interesting data point.
So,
I think Yvonne had something.
Yeah, I missed like on the whole discussion and review process because holiday season basically and vacation. And I will write my opinion there. One thing we previously did with a big disagreement is example of like input unions. It was a big disagreement for a long time. So and it showed that if something is like it's not if like it's hard to resolve, there is like 2 solutions. Either like have a separate discussion for that because it's easier for people to discuss, And if not, we can have like a short call. I don't think it's like as big as input unions, but in case of input unions, it helps to move it forward. One cool thing I want to point out, and I write it in an issue, if we do square braces syntax, and why I want to resolve like it, I think because it's like it's a new IC node, and IC nodes can have directives. So another potential cool thing, if we stick with square braces, we can allow like directives. So we can allow directives to be applied on. So imagine if we decide to make bank as a directive, and right now we cannot apply it like arrays deeper. But if we introduce field name and set of square braces, you can specify, you can apply directive not on field itself, but on some of the nesting lists. So I think it's like a big like a plus for square braces syntax. I will write it in an issue, yeah, to continue asynchronous.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
What also might help, Alex, is just to open some GitHub discussions around the remaining open issues around this. I think like part of what makes this a bit challenging is that you've got everything sort of threaded in one big RFC list, and it's just there are sort of multiple threads of discussion happening now, and it's hard for people to keep up or to understand like what the state of each one of them is, which makes the whole thing kind of feel ambiguously in limbo, which it doesn't feel good in terms of advancing this. So my like just practical advice that you can do, especially if you're blocked on other things, is just to get like a thread open for each of the major remaining pieces. It seems like you have a couple. One of them is getting an implementation done behind an experimental flag. And it's just like, okay, what are the blockers? Like what, that should not be blocked on any spec discussion, because the whole point of that is to get something down that you can play with and be able to write test cases around things when people have issues. And that seems expressly useful. A second one is making sure the syntax is right. I think getting the list one, or just like exploring the options and narrowing it down. And then the last one is the relay team, and Joe in particular, giving some feedback around the semantics. And I know even beyond that, there's just been some open questions around, does a question mark act as an error boundary versus as a making something nullable? And like these all feel interrelated to me, and there's a larger problem at play. And just to kind of stick my 1.5 cents in there is, I think our goal here is always going to be to balance between providing neutral semantics that work for lots of different tools that use GraphQL, while also best supporting the tools that people most frequently use, Relay and Apollo Client being probably the top two among them. And they have their quirks, and they leverage fragments in a way that's pretty different from the way that the server leverages them. So I think we owe exploring that space more clearly. We might end up with something that's like halfway to where we want to be. I think Joe's feedback pointed out that the proposal that that he and Matt are putting up is probably an important step in the direction of getting to a complete state where Relay can start to remove some of their compiler steps and rely on vanilla GraphQL. I don't know if your proposal alone will get us there because of that, but at least feeling like we have the right stacked up set of things that each independently feel good, and then in aggregate feel like it's going to solve the problems in a way that everyone agrees is the right thing to do. That feels like we need to have some discussion on that, and having a space where we can know what we're talking about. It's not about the entire spec. It's like specifically about like the semantics of throwing and catching errors will be pretty helpful.
Yeah, I think so. The single threaded thing is it's become unwieldy. It's not good.
Rob did also something like that, like a discussion with multiple threads on GitHub on his repo. It was different stream. It was really good.
Agreed.
I think that's everything I had. Yeah. Like I said in the last meeting, work on this for me is gonna slow down. I got to do some other projects at work, but I'm gonna keep working at it.
That's good to know. I think that's probably going to work out well. Actually, I think my sense is the next phase for this. It's like we've gotten through the initial exploratory, this is an exciting idea everyone wants to see done, and we've gotten to the common but frustrating phase of noodling out the exact semantics and getting broad consensus that they're the right ones, and that often takes time. And part of the reason why it takes time is that everyone needs to really consume what's going on and provide meaningful feedback that's not just like off the cuff, but actually like factors in all the context, and that takes time. So in advance, I appreciate your patience with that process. Hopefully it won't take forever. I'm very excited about seeing this one through. I think this is, I've said it before, but this is one of the proposals I've been most excited about in recent years. So I think probably most people would agree that's part of the reason why there's a lot of feedback here, is that people are actually really excited about it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm can't wait to get it merged, get to use it. It's gonna be awesome.
Can I just briefly say, I wanted to I added a note at the end of my comment, but I wanted to kind of say in person, I know it must be really frustrating to get some of the pushback. But I feel like this is kind of really tugging at a thread, a loose thread in the design of GraphQL, where it's okay, client specified nullability is problematic because we haven't really fundamentally figured out the issues with fragments. And then if you figure out the issues with fragments, that leads you to oh, well, actually the response model is wrong. And also to fix the response model, you need to figure out the fact that actually we need object identity. And so it's this long list of things that actually has to get sorted out that are just missing and underspecified in GraphQL. And it's so I think what I suspect might happen is that this is we all want the end product of this. But what might have to happen is that we actually start at the beginning and are work backwards to all these things that are required to really get this right. But if we do that process, GraphQL will be so much better because we'll have figured out all these fundamental issues. So I don't know, I'm really excited to finally have enough people realizing that this is a problem and that we can start tackling all these limitations that we've known about for a long time.
Yeah, we can.
I'm just super excited to go through the process with y'all.
We can talk more in the PR, but I wanted to ask if there's this whole chain of issues. Do you feel like they need to be solved? We need to solve. I forgot what the last one was on the end, object identity or something. Inward or is client controlled nullability untenable until the fragments issue is fixed?
I don't know. I think there may be and that's why I was trying to at least give some ideas of what we might do that mitigates the concerning challenges. I think we still need to just work through is a variant of the proposal, because what I'm really concerned about is basically bubbling past fragment boundaries, right, in a way that just kind of causes too much of the result to get nulled out. If we can find a reasonable way to have that not be the default, that doesn't require fragment, fully solving fragment modularity, that would be a great outcome. And so we should try to figure that out so that we don't have to couple everything together. Yeah.
This is also kind of what I was hinting at before. I think I don't want to, or I'd like to avoid a state where we have to solve all of these in order, because we've already taken a couple of cracks at these problems before and not made the progress that we wanted to make. And that's not to say that they're not solvable. I think that they probably are, but I expect that they could take a number of additional cracks at them until we finally figure it out. And if there's a bunch of downstream things that we just can't do because we can't solve those first, that's of course going to be frustrating and therefore something we should avoid if possible. An outcome that I would like to land on is one where we understand enough of the design space of those other problems such that we have confidence that the thing that we are advancing and putting into the spec does not preclude exploring that space, and that space will compose well with this. So for example, Joe's motivation here, which is a very reasonable one, is to have all these pieces together such that you can provide client-controlled nullability with modular fragments included. There's Joe and Matt are introducing a proposal about modular fragments, right? Like what I see is, can we end up with something that both syntactically and semantically naturally extend to not just like one specific version of what they're proposing, but like the whole design space. Like we don't end up with something where like, oh, now that we've landed this, we've ruled out the ability to extend to this to modular fragments. That would be a no-go. So it's going to require at least enough exploration of those to know that we're not blocking it. But my hope is that we can do some of these things in parallel. That means that we could end up in a state where, you know, maybe the syntax could be consumed by Relay, but they wouldn't omit the syntax directly through to a server. They would still parse it and do something unique with it in the same way that they're doing with that required. And maybe that's an incremental value, but you know, it's clearly not going to be acceptable for Relay to take on some change which just breaks its core functionality. That's not going to work. But that's why I'm saying, like, there's just a bunch of design space here that we need to go explore. And I think our shared goal should be to unlink these to the degree that we can, such that we can advance the ones that are ready and know that they will eventually compose together and link up once we have them all. It's going to be tough, but I think that's what I'd like to see. Sweet. Sounds good. Thanks again for your hard work on this, Alex. Always exciting to see progress. And even though you're blocked sometimes, sounds like we do actually have good next steps here. For sure. All right, handing it to Yvonne to talk about directives.
Yeah, I will send the issue in the chat to save people from looking for agenda. So idea, if you open an issue, and it's pretty short, so no need to probably to share a screen. Idea is that I'm personally for a long time I was opposing directives and directives until I learned two things happened. First, the spec itself started relying on directives more and more. So we have like specify by, we have like deprecated, and directives, and it's look like directives is a way forward, not overcomplicated syntax, but it creates a precedent when you cannot use directives. You cannot deprecate the directive, or you cannot, like, for example, in Apollo, like specifically for federation, for other use cases, there is a mechanism to attach URL to directives. And it's very similar to specify by. So it would be cool to have like a way to attach like specify by to directives. And it's like there is use case for that. It would be great to standardize on that, but it's such a bigger issue. Basically, like we create a new mechanisms which is not applicable in directives. And one of the reasons I was opposing to, there is like kind of like big problem with directives. Directives can be used in queries and inside the SDL. It's very easy to validate directives inside queries because like schema is built already, types is known, but it's very hard to validate directives inside the SDL. So imagine you have directive definition inside the SDL and it's applied on a type inside the same SDL. So it's happened, people defining directives and using them in the same file. So it's hard to validate. Actually, we don't have validation in GraphQL.js for that right now. But after rereading the spec, I discovered that we already paid the price. If you look into issue validate, there is a validation section, and it's basically say like because of GraphQL language and because arguments are the same in directives and in fields, since we can apply directives on arguments, we can apply directives on directive arguments. So it's already allowed. And we have like this validation rule preventing recursion from happening. So basically, we already paid the price. This validation is not implemented in GraphQL.js. It's not implemented. I don't know about other implementation, but GraphQL.js doesn't implement it. And my plan for this proposal to move it forward is to implement like validations that we already have in a spec, merge it, and have like PRs that allow directives and directives relax it, like apply, adjust this validation to work with like this use case. Basically, so I see like two potential things. It's like this validation rule, and but we already paid the price. It's already allowed. And second thing is like syntax is kind of weird in a sense because it's like at the symbol is like used twice, but I look for position where to put like directives, and the less confusing position is after list of locations. And it's like similar to what we have on scholars. It's like directives are in the end of scholar definition, so it's kind of fit spec. But before I invest like more time into like spec PRs for like adding existing validations that we already have in spec and having spec PR for that one, I want to hear like general opinion on directives because in this issue people discussing like should we have this validation limitation or not. I think it's beyond my proposal. It's already existing. I'm not proposing. I'm actually for keeping it. What I'm interested in hearing feedback for is like, should we allow directives on directives?
I have one question regarding that. Are we talking about the high order directives, as I understand, kind of directives that are applied in other directives? But for example, if we have some kind of a list of directives, I can apply different directives to same field, for example. How I say that this directive is applied not to this type, but to another directive. Am I making braces around it, or?
So this is not for executable definitions. This is for the type system definition. So this is directives on directive definitions, which Ivan has been like, I'm pretty sure that's what he's meant, but has been aligning directive definitions.
Yeah,
okay. It's not. It will not be used in queries. It will be just on the when I. Okay, good. Sorry, then I understand differently.
Yeah, it's like you can imagine with directives are similar, can be treated similar to decorators, and most programming languages decorators functions, and you can apply decorators on function itself. So it's not like creating high order directive. It's like a directive on the same layer. You just like you apply directive to definition. I'm worried about stuff like deprecating a directive, for example. It's a good example. It's exposed to clients. You can like figure out like you don't want to support it anymore. You want to put deprecation, and you don't have any good syntax for that.
personally, I think being able to deprecate directives is highly motivating. We have a lot of directives that I want dead that people keep reusing because they don't know they're not supposed to.
Yep, that seems like the most reasonable case. We didn't always have the ability to deprecate things within the other than fields. So as that's been expanding, it makes sense to expand it here too. Yeah, I think like the original intent on not allowing directives was one, to avoid the recursion problem, which exists now that we have reused argument definitions, which the arguments themselves can have a directive or nested within. So the fact that we don't have an implementation for that validation rule seems not great. And I think this comes from our validation of queries has always been very good. That code is predates open source. Validation for schemas has always been kind of playing catch up, and this seems like one that it hasn't been implemented yet. One thing that I'd like to know is just how challenging it is to implement that. Hopefully it's not too bad. It's a tree crawl, but if it's really, part of the intent here was to avoid having to ask implementers to put in particularly complicated stuff like that. If you find that it ends up being not too hard to implement, then that's maybe an argument that that's not enough cost to keep it out. But the other one was confusion. I think even just you're looking at saying like, where would you even put a directive on the directive to not end up with something that looks really confusing? That actually was the larger of the motivations to not have this, was as soon as you put directives on directives, the syntax starts looking really confusing. And maybe the motivation here that we want to be able to deprecate directives is enough to push past that. But yeah, that's at least some historical context for why we haven't had this up till this point. I'm not necessarily opposed. I think we got to get the details right.
About complexity cost, it's like what I want to do. It's just like, I don't know the scope of it. And I want basically to have like two pairs. One pair is like implementing what we already have in a spec. So, and another pair on top of that showing like what is the difference. I think like we need to match pair for what we already have in spec anyway. And I expect it to be big, but reasonable. And the difference between directives on arguments and directives on directives, I expect it to be like tiny, basically, and mostly test cases.
Yeah, so one point on just like the location, getting kind of to lead confusion, this could be confusing, is I know union type definitions have a very similar syntax to directive definitions with the line or bar, whatever, to separate things that the types in the same way that the directive definition uses it to separate locations. And the union type definition puts the directive right after the name, which, yeah, that like figuring out whether it should go there or at the end is a question that we should work through. But
yeah, kind of like crazy idea. Just how about directives? Can we kind of have like double add? You specify directives and directives, you use double add sign, and we can like have small adjustment to syntax. So if it's like add full, it's like part of definition. If it's add deprecated, it's like deprecation for directive. with something, and in that case we can put it immediately after a name, because the problem with why I didn't put it after a name, because like arguments are optional, and it would be at full, at bar, and so it would be like by confusing. What do you think about like double at?
I don't like double at. It's like I would only want to add more punctuation if it's solving a language conflict issue. It's like you need to read 1 versus 2 ats to disambiguate. But like if we got ourselves so far down the syntax rabbit hole that we need to disambiguate with extra punctuation, then we've probably already failed to help people understand what it is we're doing. Lauren, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, is this need for specifying directives on directives in general, or for this use case, the deprecated directive? Like, because I had, like, right now I had the idea that, for example, in JS doc, you also have like this at deprecated, but instead of having it as like a language feature, it's more like a comment in the document string that you write in front of your function or your property or whatever. And I know it's a crazy idea and we already have the add directive, but what if you would write this add deprecated reason as part of the document string that can be in front of a directives definition, a field definition, an argument definition, or whatever? Obviously it would be a breaking change, but yeah, just wanted to share my thoughts.
It wouldn't be that big a breaking change because we already have repeatable on the directive definition. If we put deprecated right after repeatable as an optional, and like we could make deprecated a more first class thing potentially, but I don't know.
Yeah, to clarify my scope about my primary motivation was actually specified by. So I use, because like deprecation is more widespread, I just use it as a banner. But idea is like, basically, I want to have like a more generic mechanism, because like Apollo use core spec, and like without directives and directives, we cannot even start conversation of like specify by on directives. And so like we have 2 use cases, and I expect like in a year somebody propose some feature and we introduce like a third directive based on like progression. I think like more and more features we add into spec will be directives instead of syntax. Like I think Crasher right now is like 50-50 or something. For queries, we don't add new syntax at all, except like triple quotation and like force nullability. But for SDL, it was like 50-50. Repeatable on versus like deprecated on more stuff specified by. So for me, it's like generic issue of if we use the same one mechanism on everything else or other definitions, I would like to use the same features and same mechanism on directives.
Yep, that seems reasonable. I think you probably need to explore the syntax a little bit more. But I think that the staging of this makes sense, where you first you got to make sure that
so based on a
rule is in place.
Like basically, I wanted consensus that it's something worth exploring, right? And people consider, and I get like this feedback. So thanks about this. And like about staging, can I move it stage 1 to kind of like start working on PR and full procedure?
Anyone want to explicitly not have this go to stage 1? All right, stage 1 it is. Changed it. Sounds like there's plenty of open questions. You've got some good feedback on the thread, but let this discussion be a good reminder for anyone interested in this to go take a look. I just added some stuff there as well. Mostly posterity for stuff we already discussed. All right, thank you, Yvonne. We have 15 minutes left and 2 20-minute topics left. So before we move forward, let's just have a quick meta discussion of how we want to proceed. I think we likely only have time for one of the last 2 topics, and the other we'll have to wait and talk about in the next meeting. Which of these is going to be more pressing or is more willing to wait until next month?
Maybe I can do just one of my bullet points.
Sure, let's do that. Rob, will let you go through one of your bullet points. We'll halt conversation and do conversation async, just to save some time for Stephen, and then whatever we miss, we'll pick back up in next meeting. So go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, just gonna share my screen. Yeah, so we talked about this briefly in the last meeting, and this is what happens when you have multiple mutations in the same operation. Right now, the entire first tree gets executed before the second one starts. What happens if you have a defer somewhere nested under here? The one thing that I think everyone agreed on was that we should not allow deferring the actual mutation field at the root level of the operation. So I've implemented that and put it in the spec draft. But otherwise, I guess I just kind of want to get consensus that we're okay with what's listed here as option 2. Lee, you had said last week that that's generally what you felt like was the right option.
I think that's probably still right.
Yeah, the one thing that is a bit good. So I played around with this also in our implementation. The one thing at the moment, if you do a mutation and then you immediately process a subtree, you essentially get the changed state of this mutation. If you defer it, data could have changed and you don't get necessarily the changed state of this mutation anymore.
Right. So I think what we would be saying is that by putting defer somewhere in there, you're opting into that being a possibility.
Yeah. I think like another, calling back to our previous conversation around the list nullability, I think it's helpful for us to be really practical about the ramifications of this, right? So like option 1 is you essentially ignore defer and stream directives. Oh, I see, you said on all but the last mutation. Like even that is like you get inconsistency between whether they'd be followed or not based on where they're located in the query. I don't love that. But like even if you decided to go with some version of option 1 that just, you know, say like, hey, we can't make these guarantees, so we're just gonna not do defer and stream. I suspect 99.999% of mutations are on a single field. And maybe that'll expand in the future. There've been some proposals about nested mutations and grouped mutations, but certainly the vast majority now favor a single mutation per query. In which case, you know, like this whole conversation is kind of in the weeds. You know, most people are not going to see it. and the option 2 sort of like captures that, I think, somewhat reasonably. So it could be that in the future, if there is some change to how we do mutations, if we do nested mutations or grouped mutations or some of these other proposals, and then those things come after defer and stream's work has completed, we may revisit some of the semantics of defer and stream in the context of those things. That would be a reasonable thing to do. But at present, we should look at what we have, and we should do the thing that would be what a consumer of GraphQL would expect. I think that's option 2.
All right, so I'll move forward with making sure that it's adequately described in the spec draft. It's already what the JS implementation is doing.
Sweet.
Yeah, the second issue I was going to discuss was about non-null fields, but so if anyone else would like to look at this discussion for the next meeting, we can talk about it more then. I'll put it in the chat.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you for breaking these out into discussions and in their own space. That is super helpful for helping people dig through these. So yeah, in the last minute before we move on to Stephen, just a call for action for folks to go take a look at not just these discussions, but Rob's whole repo is doing a great job of categorizing through all the remaining open questions. All right, Stephen, you get 10 minutes instead of 20. Hopefully that's enough to talk about deprecation of input values.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Lee. So, so yeah, for today, a goal would be getting, this is our stage 2 RFC. And so if we can get concrete action items to stage 3, first, let me give just a bit of context what we're talking about here. One of GraphQL's strengths is excellent support for living, evolving APIs. And one of the GraphQL features that helps APIs evolve is first-class support for a deprecation flow. And now the spec allows deprecated directive on output fields and enum values, but not on arguments or input object fields today. But it has been proposed as early as 2016 to extend deprecated to apply to inputs. And the idea of supporting deprecation inputs, it hasn't been particularly controversial, I don't think. But as always, the devil is in the details. And so that brings us to today. There is a PR in the spec that has reached RFC stage 2. So it's a draft and it's linked here. And this has been implemented in GraphQL JS and others as well, GraphQL Java. There's one main outlying question that came up last time this was discussed. And that is the detail of whether to permit marking required arguments and required input fields as deprecated. And by required, we're saying non-null and without a default value. And so, in previous discussion, we were talking about this should be at least discouraged in the spec, but possibly disallowed entirely. So then the nuance in wording there is it a must or a should? And so I've submitted a PR on this RFC to make this a should. And 2 main reasons for that is that the GraphQL spec recommends hiding things that are deprecated. And so it would make for a confusing experience for clients to have a required field that is hidden. And then also the other reason is that it, if we were to change our mind, it would be a non-breaking change to relax the spec from must to should. But doing the inverse would potentially be breaking of APIs in the field. So then for today, for our last 8 minutes, there's, is this controversial to go ahead and move forward with must? And then also, what is lacking to get us to stage 3?
I'm trying to page back into my brain everything that it's been a while since we talked about this topic. Do you remember if there were any other open issues or open questions around deprecating input values aside from this one that you just talked about?
See, that was the main thing, or at least the kind of the last thing. There had been some others. Let me look back at I've also linked notes from previous discussion 18 months ago here.
Yeah, I can provide context on that. Initially, it was proposed, I forget who was initial champion. When I helped to move it, it was merged into GraphQL.js with, I think, like, I'm as non-native speaker, I'm not sure like I understand how different between must and should, but it's required in GraphQL.js. Moreover, it's like validated and nobody objected. And it's merged for 16 months. It's like was merged once before TypeScript conversion. It was in, I sent git blame and like the whole thing was merged, and like with particular validation was merged like because we had consensus on working group 16 months. Basically, I was a bottleneck as a second champion of that. And bottleneck was to write it in a spec. I like implemented the code and merged it since it was stage 2, but I had like half finished markdown change in my stash, so it's very helpful, really great that you create PR against it. Basically, practically speaking, nobody objected for 16 months. You can see it in git blame. It was released like almost immediately, I think like in month 2. So like at least for 14, 15 months, like more than a year, nobody objected.
So, Ivan, let me make sure I understand what you said. You said we've already merged, at least into the reference implementation, we've merged this behavior. You can put deprecated on an argument. And if you put it on an argument that is required, you will get a validation error.
Yeah. One asterisk, like it's historical, but graphical previously, before XSS vulnerability, it wouldn't perform like validation of a schema. So like graphical enforce with restriction only for like a couple of months, and I also heard like anybody object. So I think like, and people I think start using deprecation on arguments, so I think it's enough time.
I don't know how we missed that. We got this merged and out, but we're just like behind on the spec text, I guess. Okay, yeah, Stephen.
And yeah, I remember the other outlying question, not really outlying, but was whether to possibly invert the introspection default to include deprecated inputs. But once again, the non-inverted behavior is implemented in GraphQL.js, and apparently hasn't been controversial.
Non-inverted. Sorry, help me remember the inverted and non-inverted semantics.
So meaning by default, do you include deprecated input arguments, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Yvonne, that we went with by default they're not included, the same as other deprecated things.
Same as other. It was like a couple issues with that, mostly with implementation, but not directly to with behavior. It was mostly with like how to correctly generate introspection query. Yeah, and it was also fixed like a year ago or something.
Cool. Yeah, I think the behavior that we have seems like the right one, because the principle there is you should be able to write an introspection query, and if you never include the phrase include deprecated anywhere in your introspection query, you'll only ever get back non-deprecated schema. And so that principle would be applied here if we are doing the not inverted behavior, which it sounds like is what is implemented. So in terms of your question and next steps to get to stage 3 approved, it's let's make sure we do a double check on the reference implementation, and like actually what would be the most helpful is if we could pull links to the unit tests that assert the behavior that we have described in the spec. because then when we publish it to stage 3 and approved, we can say like, look right here, here's the part in the code that you can go read that implements these things. That would be super helpful for people who are following along. And then the other to do to get to stage 3 is the getting the spec text in a final form for editorial review. So since your pull request is about merging a change into another pull request, I think we should just add that in now so that we have a single source of truth for that.
Sounds good. So we'll go ahead and merge the PR on the PR, and then we can do final review on the spec text, and I'll take that first action item. If Yvonne, you could help me out with gathering those, the links to those particular unit tests.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit behind on my inbox. So if you GitHub inbox, so if you need something like that to be merged, you can ping me directly in Slack or somewhere Twitter, and I can merge it. Any other changes or stuff, and I will rebase it after PR is merged.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, with that, we are a few seconds from the end of the hour. Congratulations, everyone. You made it through a very long list of topics today. Even though we had to cut a couple of them a little shorter than we would like. That means more to discuss async between now and the next one, and certainly some agendas for us to pick up next time. Thank you all for all your hard work. It's really super exciting to see just how many things are in flight right now. I think even if you just compare kind of the status of where we are now to this time last year, we're probably working on twice as many things now as we were then. And that was just a year ago, let alone when this working group first started. And I think we're now on year 5 of this working group. When was what's our oldest agenda in the file? 2017. So almost 5 years since the first of these. That's pretty amazing. So thanks everybody for the hard work that you do. And I hope you all have a great 2022, and see you all next month.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye.